Hi everyone, welcome to the 7th event in the Davis Museum's virtual artist talk series, Handmade Photography Today. My name is Ashley Bistrom and I use she, hers pronouns. I'm a member of the class of 2022 majoring in anthropology and environmental studies, and I am a student visitor assistant at the Davis. Tonight we are pleased to welcome the artist David Benjamin Sherry, who reinvigorates landscape photography of the American West through a combination of environmentalism, queer identity, and analog photographic processes. We begin with the native land acknowledgement. Wellesley College occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded lands of the Massachusetts tribe. We recognize that we are on stolen land, and we extend our gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples who have rich histories here, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations for their ongoing stewardship of the land. We commit to recognizing, supporting, and advocating for the sovereignty of the Indigenous nations whose traditional territories are in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as well as for the many Indigenous peoples who live, work, and study in Wellesley and Massachusetts. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and commit to holding Wellesley College more accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples. This land acknowledgement was created by the Wellesley Native American Student Association, and we thank them for their labor. To participate in today's program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We are using a webinar format and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions and to upvote other questions. We will have 20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. The Davis Museum is grateful to the Burns Schwartz Family Foundation for sponsoring the Handmade Photography Today Artist Talk series. We would also like to acknowledge our co-host, the Photographic Resource Center. Located at Wellesley University, the PRC hosts exhibitions, presentations, and gatherings that support the creation and understanding of light-based media with the goal of inspiring its members, educational institutions, and the photography community with new work, ideas, and methods. For more information, visit prcboston.org. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Carrie Cushman, the Linda Wyatt Gruber, class of 1966 Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davis Museum, who will introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you as well to the Davis Museum's Student Visitor Assistant, Brian Rowe, and to Communications and Technology Assistant, Adele Gang, for providing assistance behind the scenes with tonight's webinar. Our discussant for this evening is Erich Hatala Matthes, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Faculty Director of the Camilla Chandler Frost 47 Center for the Environment at Wellesley College. His research focuses on the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of cultural heritage, with particular emphasis on art and the environment. His first book, Drawing the Line, What to Do with the Work of Immoral Artists from Museums to the Movies, will be published by Oxford University Press in October 2021. We are very much looking forward to it, Eric. In conversation with Eric, we are so pleased to welcome the artist David Benjamin Sherry. David Benjamin Sherry is a New Mexico-based artist who is both challenging and reinvigorating American photography. Best known for his colorful landscape photographs, his work revolves around interests in environmentalism, queer identity, and alternative film processes, brought upon by the desire to explore the last remaining wilderness in America. Through numerous projects, Sherry's work expresses deep concern for the rapidly changing environment, while continuing to sustain a queer sensibility in the hetero-male-dominated canon of landscape photography. Sherry uses a large format 8x10 film camera in order to reflect and understand our connection within the contemporary American landscape. Sherry was born in 1981 in Stony Brook, New York, and currently lives and works in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He received his BFA in photography from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2003 and his MFA in photography from Yale University in 2007, where he was awarded the Richard Dixon Welling Prize. In 2010, he received the Remo Hort Mann Foundation Visual Arts Grant. A multi-part installation of his work was exhibited in Greater New York 2010 at MoMA PS1, a survey show organized by Klaus Biesenbach, Connie Butler, and Neville Wakefield. His work has been exhibited in numerous solo presentations and also included in many group presentations, including The Anxiety of Photography at the Aspen Art Museum, New York Minute at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, Out of Focus at Saatchi Gallery in London, Lost Line at LACMA, What is a Photograph at the International Center for Photography, Photo Focus Biennale in Cincinnati, Color Fields at Mass Art Museum, and Ansel Adams in Our Time at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. His work is in permanent collections at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Nasher Museum of Art, the Walker Center, Wexner Center of the Arts, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the RISD Museum, the Saatchi Collection, the Alphon Collection of Contemporary Art, Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and the Marciano Foundation in Los Angeles. I'm so pleased to have you here tonight with us, David, and I will hand the virtual floor over to you.
Hello, thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you everyone for joining today. I am currently on the road out taking some pictures and in Utah. So I am using the Wi-Fi in this place and hopefully nothing strange happens, but if it does, we'll take it from there. But I'll jump right in and let's see, I'm going to share my presentation. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start with a project that I started in graduate school in 2006 in New Haven, Connecticut. I was at Yale University. I went to undergrad at RISD and studied photography, and my work shifted and changed over the years as I learned more and more about the medium and the process, all analog technology at that point, which was 1999. So by the time I got to Yale 2006, most people were shooting film but printing digitally. And I had kind of free reign over the color darkrooms and black and white darkrooms at the school. So it was just like this incredible time of experimentation for me. So also when I was in graduate school, I was kind of a late bloomer, and I was coming out of the closet. So pretty much through my work, I was kind of entertaining these feelings and putting it out there into the world through the medium of photography, and pretty much came out in a critique, which felt great. And I couldn't have had more support around me by, like-minded people and other artists and creatives, and also Yale's kind of incredible LGBTQ then they didn't have department. So I got to take great history classes and got to, really dig deep into the history of artists, queer artists, writers. And so one artist that I really fell in love with was Kenneth Anger. And actually I knew of Kenneth Anger's work before I started graduate school, but Kenneth Anger was an underground filmmaker in the 60s and 70s, 80s. He still makes work. I don't know if he still makes work, but he's had some retrospective exhibitions in the last decade or so. But Kenneth Anger's work was pretty hard to find at this point, and I had got my hands on some VHS cassette tapes and just would watch them over and over and over. And there's this beautiful kind of way that he used his practice to kind of induce this magical spell and use his queer energy as this kind of power to entice the viewer. And it just completely took over my own understanding of what art can do and what visual let's say, I don't know, photography and video film have a lot of connections. It's an image ultimately. So I just really like this kind of celluloid analog process that he was casting these spells through his work. So I started making work inspired by that, as many young artists do, I think, when they're younger and figuring things out. So I began this kind of unorthodox darkroom process that I figured out. When I was in graduate school, there was this incredible master printer, photographer, Richard Benson, who is also the dean for the School of Art. So it was just this really special time for me because he, under his guidance, he really helped me figure out and supported my darkroom experimentation. So I pretty much figured out this kind of alternative process where I'd use color film and I'd push the color with the filters in the actual darkroom enlarger to achieve this kind of vibrant monochrome color. So once I understood this as a process, I just kind of took off with it. And sometimes, like in this picture, I actually, would body paint myself the same color as the landscape and kind of see what happens, and it was just really an exciting time for me to figure out how the chemicals within color photography really can get pushed to an extreme. And if you push them too far, they could break down in shadow detail and all these little, corners where you should have detail, things could really fall apart. So it was really finding this sweet spot of where the color is extremely vibrant and it's all kind of analog made. This is also, 2009, this photograph is. So a lot of people were questioning like, oh, why don't you just use Photoshop? But part of my process was about trying to figure out how to do these things analog. I just got so much joy out of that. And then I started taking landscape photographs as I diversified this body of work, which I called Birth and Future Verse. And pretty much I wanted to take portraits and landscapes and still life and self-portraits. I kind of wanted to go through the canon of what we think of as fine art photography and kind of break it down in this new monochrome, surreal, magical world where I was kind of funneling in all this queer identity, life, personal stuff, because ultimately all these pictures are from my life, from my I was traveling, I was going through a lot of different things, and the pictures are in many ways diaristic of what I was going through. And sometimes I'd use the titles to kind of give this little extra glimpse into something diaristic, let's say. Earlier in undergrad, I was doing a lot more diaristic work. I was photographing my life, my family, my friends, until it eventually got to my senior thesis, where I started photographing myself. And it was very important, like stepping stone work for me to kind of feel comfortable enough to put my life into my work and basically come out through the process of art making. So my references kind of went all over the place as I started finding these subtle, beautiful, subtext of queer identity from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And for instance, this was hanging up in my little studio at the time, and I just loved that cover. I mean, I found it erotic, but also I thought it was just this beautiful way, an elegant kind of stance and the statuesque kind of perfect body. And then you listen to the song that completely subverts the idea of, queerness and being, hiding your identity, because the song was written in 1980s, so early 1980s in the UK, so things were a lot different. But I really kind of dug deep into this archive of music, film, and artwork and poetry that felt like it was made from this kind of closeted space. And I think it was because I could identify with it. so well, because at that point I had just been out of the closet for a few years. Mind you, I had two moms. My mom left my dad when I was about 5 for another woman. So I was raised with a lot of queer culture, but it was the 80s, and things were a lot different. Most of my mother's friends were all dying from AIDS. And to process that as a child, it was intense, and it pushed my own identity deeper into this closet that became a creative space for me, but also, it was somewhat of a traumatic adolescence because so much of my identity was pushed down, mostly because I didn't understand how AIDS and HIV affected, at a really young age. I just figured like, oh, if I'm gay, if I identify as gay, I will die. It was this kind of understanding of death at a really young age. And my moms were not fully out yet. So I kind of learned about the closet from them and living with them. I felt like I had to be in the closet for them because I'd be, bullied in school, which for having gay parents. It was just a different time. Also, I wouldn't take back any of that because it made me who I am now. Here's a photograph that I made kind of after staring at that record for years, which was kind of this explosion of myself in many ways, and became this important photograph for me. It still is. I still enjoy, it was like undressing and exposing my backside to the world, but I felt like I had this really androgynous shape, and it kind of disappears in the highlights of the body. And I enjoyed this kind of magical push and pull of what's real and what's not real, and how does something exist in a photograph, which technically is recorded, light on film with chemistry, and what can happen in between that to make it kind of seem surreal. Much like I think life up until this point for me felt, because my identity was so wrapped up in, I didn't know who I was. And a lot of that had to do with my queer identity. So as I started making more landscape pictures, it really started to, I really just got caught up with how amazing the West was. This was kind of one of my first or second trips. This was work made. I probably shot this photograph in earlier than 2011, but I usually date the works when I print them. So I grew up on the East Coast and upstate New York and Woodstock, New York. So I had not really any idea of what the West was. And I was just really drawn to it as I started getting older, because not even because of landscapes, I just felt like there was this energy that I connected deeper with out West. I'm just by nature a friendly person. And like when I'm hiking or walking down the street, I'd smile and say hello to people. And I worked for many years in like food service, and I think maybe it started from that, like being a waiter and making people's coffees, and just like how much better life can be when you're really, you can say hello. And I mean, not like every day is, I can, I'm not like always really happy-go-lucky, but I'm just saying there's this part of myself that was identified with maybe the culture out West. As soon as I started coming out West, people were smiling and saying hello. And I felt like, oh, these are my people. This is where I feel more comfortable, more myself. So anyway, these were some of the first trips out West. And I was just in awe, as many people are when they first go to Yellowstone National Park, or this is Yosemite National Park. This photograph was probably the first one I had made in a national park that that really kind of came to life as I printed it. In many ways, my process is, I'd like to say it's very similar to black and white photography, where I'm actually shooting for the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and thinking of all of them, and trying to, the color itself kind of becomes this veil over the black and white. To me, I started understanding the importance of what I was maybe, I wouldn't say this yet, actually. Like, I didn't really know what I was doing with landscape at this point. I was just like in awe of these beautiful places. But I did understand that there's a lot of connections here between black and white photography and what I was doing. And yeah, it kind of pushed me deeper into wanting to go west and wanting to photograph in the West. So this brings me to Astral Desert, which is 2011. Pretty much in 2011, I started going through the deserts. So I traveled a lot, mostly through Utah and New Mexico. And I started taking, large format pictures. At this point, I was working with a 4x5 camera. And, I knew that I was following in the footsteps of a very specific group of landscape photographers and artists. And I was really, drawn to Georgia O'Keeffe's work. I mean, it's just beautiful. And there's just something that really can, the color of each landscape, to me, it's like, how abstract could she go with using color and form, but also tying it back to the landscape. So I started going deeper into like these kind of horizonless artworks, and was taking a lot of inspiration from these because I just really enjoyed the abstraction and just staring at the ground and kind of creating these abstract works. And I was like, oh, these would look so great if I can make them with my large format camera and do this monochrome process. So I started making these trips and started editing these pictures, and made my first exhibition in 2012, actually, which was in New York City at my gallery, which is Salon 94. And I think here's an installation shot. This project, not only was I interested in making these large scale abstractions, like way larger than life size. This is just looking down at the ground pretty much, and seeing how large I can go with them analog, using color darkrooms to make these prints and pushing the color to like the brightest, most saturated colors I can get, like what would happen. And it just became this kind of dazzling performance, and to me, it started really coming full circle about what my process is, and that like part of my process is taking the pictures and being outdoors and exploring places that I'm not familiar with. And then the other part of the process is the dark room, which is like very much a performance for me because it's all in the dark. Color photography analog is not like black and white in the sense that there's actually no light. So it's all done in complete darkness. So it's a lot of touching and feeling. It's very tactile. So the prints themselves started to feel kind of tactile for me. And that tactileness became part of the subject in many ways, because I wanted people to understand that this was done analog. These aren't Photoshop pictures. So I started making even more darkroom work. And this is all still part of the same exhibition. This was a photogram that I made based off of a photograph. So I would basically draw this out onto cardboard and create a photogram in the darkroom, which is it's making sorry, I'm distracted because there's a weed whacker coming right through here, and I'm just worried he's about to start weed whacking. If he does, I apologize. So the photogram is a negative. There's basically a blank negatives, which becomes a film base, and then the light would go through that, and I'd use the filters within the enlarger to pass through the negative onto light sensitive paper, and I would create these constructions in the dark with cardboard and move them around to create these photograms. And I felt like that was a good way to start talking about the analog process with all of this work. the same time, I started actually making these, what I called sand prints, which were pretty much just photographs of the place, and I would dye the sand. I'd print the picture in a monochrome hue, but then I'd also dye sand the same color as the print and do a light dust coat and use this adhesive on top of the print. So I wanted to recreate this kind of psychedelic, otherworldly desert ambiance within the gallery setting. Again, it comes down to like this kind of performance for me. And also, I felt like I was cracking open a tradition that I could add something new to. I had never seen monochrome, vibrant colored abstractions in landscapes before. So it pretty much, with making this work, there couldn't be, I was more tuned into the environment than I really ever had been. And with that, with making this work, it pretty much amplified my kind of own environmental inclinations. So I was reading Desert Solitaire at the time, which is written by Edward Abbey, and that's pretty much where I took part of the title for the exhibition, Astral Desert, from part of his writing. So from here, I made this project called Earth Changes, which was kind of a dream residency that I had gotten, where I not only can make the monochrome photographs on the wall, but I actually was given pretty much free reign to do anything I wanted, and given like a budget to do it. So like, what's your dream exhibition? I was like, oh, I had this idea about dyeing these rocks that were, like hanging out like nearby, that weren't being like dragged from a landscape. I mean, at some point they probably were, but at this point they're just like sitting in a lot. So I was like, can I use those rocks and dye them and make this exhibition of dyed rocks? So this is what I called Earth Changes. And Earth Changes became this title of actually a book that I made, because I really enjoyed thinking about using these words to describe what's happening environmentally, which kind of brought me to this next project, Wonderful Land. So at this point, I knew that I was making, I was going down well-trodden territory of large format Western landscapes. And I kind of became, I became interested in revisiting these famous Western landscapes that I'd seen in the early historic photographs of Carleton Watkins, Edward Muybridge, William Henry Jackson, Ansel Adams. But, I attempted to create a lot of these iconic landscapes that were really crucial to our collective understanding of the American West. But I, noticed that many of the locations just were completely deteriorating and affected by human interference. So in many ways, this work, which began as like an homage to Grand Western landscape photographic legacy, became an opportunity to build upon it. There's this one artist, Minor White, who started, his work crept into my mind, because I wasn't too familiar with his work, but I knew that he started Aperture, which is a huge, great foundation and really important to photographic history and its emergence as an art form through their publications and books. But also Minor White was like a really huge part of it. He started it. So I knew that he was queer. I didn't know if he was really fully out, but he became this kind of icon person in my life that did all this Western and Eastern landscape work, but also he did a lot of male nudes and a lot of abstractions with large format cameras. So I was thinking a lot about him. And then I started finding these Georgia O'Keeffe landscapes that she would paint in monochrome, which became really also an inspiration and pushed me to continue this line of work. Like, I'm like, there's something here that I can bring new to the table. so I began this project, and this is when my camera grew from 4x5 to an 8x10, to really try to engage with this history and sit alongside, or see if I could sit alongside this, or not even sit alongside, I guess more kind of disrupt like what we think of as these Western historical photographs that were also really we're completely tied to manifest destiny and this colonializing of the West. And I think as I started making this work, I really began to understand it in a deeper way. And I think through the process of making it is kind of how I understood it. Mind you, pretty much I was traveling through the West at this point for maybe I guess 8 years. And I actually wrote this little piece about what it was like for me, and I felt like I should read it today because I think it's a good kind of glimpse into what I was experiencing. So this was written for Aperture, actually, about my favorite photo book. So I said, traversing America as a queer person, camera in hand, in search of meaning and metaphor in our troubled landscape has a certain weight to bear. The road is lonely to begin with. Add the juxtaposition of an outsider looking in and trying to navigate the suburban, rural, national park, state park, and campground cultures, all quintessentially heteronormative. It could be said the experience of seeing is heightened, the isolation stronger, the connections between nature more dramatic, and maybe the desire to be loved or to connect with others even more intense, because you're constantly made aware of your otherness. I found the strength to pursue this line of work from the varied books of American photographers that line my shelves. Though few queer ones come to mind, with the exception of Minor White, and specifically his Rites and Passages by Aperture. White's work has been an endless roadmap of encouragement, power, and comfort on some of my darkest nights while alone on the road. His own wandering through the terrain has resulted in a book of countless photographic gifts, each leading to the next: earthly matter, abstract synapses in the universe, or maybe ice forming on a window pane, blazing landscapes, erotic portraiture, empathetic abstractions. He creates a mindscape that glimmers with spiritual epiphany, a multitude of cerebral queer experiences that continually awakened him. His work is proof to me that magic is real in the world. Queerness is power, and the camera can be a tool used to harness that energy. So I think in that sense, you can kind of see that I'm starting to like really understand what my identity has, how it's tied into these environmental pictures. And the color becomes this kind of metaphor for emotional experience or performance in many ways. As you can see through some of the installation shots, I was really experimenting with the size of my pictures and the printing of them, which would, never could be done before because of color printing technology, when a lot of the earlier photographers were making their work. So this kind of brought me to Climate Vortex Sutra, which was another project I started, and pretty much it was brought on by the fact, this was a cover of New York Times where they kind of first stated that climate change is actually the climate's actually changed. So I just felt like this was becoming more mainstream. And as someone that was on the front lines, photographing throughout the West for all these years, I started really taking note in how erosion, not only erosion, but like how corporate development and land rights and all these different issues were really affecting every place that I was traveling and visiting to. Mind you, wildfires, and natural disasters were pretty much just became roadblocks all over the West as I was photographing. I also was really inspired by this incredible book by Elizabeth Kolbert, The Sixth Extinction, where she discusses all the different extinctions that have happened leading us up to the Anthropocene, which is what we're living under now as this human-caused extinction. I was thinking about early, incredible, inspiring landscape photographs by Atje, which were kind of, the beginning of my research with Western landscape, even just landscape photography, and thinking about all the work he had made with the 8x10 camera. And I was thinking about Allen Ginsberg, who is just an incredible poet that inspired me throughout my adolescence and continued to, and also I just loved his use of words. So actually the title Climate Vortex Sutra comes from a title of one of his poems, which is Wichita Vortex Sutra. There was this one Edward Weston photograph that I had found, which completely blew my mind because it was so out of this world. It just felt extremely, it just felt like, I think my mind was kind of blown by this because it felt like in this really tightly wound photographic history of large format, black and white, the 30s and 40s, like all these old white men making these photographs, like that. There was this one photograph that just completely dazzled my mind. It just felt like so psychedelic, and it really, I just printed this out and like hung it up on my wall and was like, I want to make these pictures too. I want to see this like ginormous and really colorful and just like completely, I just want to experience it. I want to do this. I want to feel this. So I also was thinking about self-portraiture and I found this kind of lineage of artists that were queer artists that were photographing themselves in drag, which I thought was kind of an interesting time for myself to maybe try that. So I did that. Sarah Charlesworth was also a pictures generation artist that I was thinking a lot about, because at the same time I was making these installations with analog work about queer identity, environmentalism, and photographic history. I was also thinking a lot about the medium and how the medium's changing, and the nature of a photograph and a picture. And Sarah Charlesworth's work is just also color. I mean, this one isn't representative of her color work, but she worked a lot in monochrome, and just it just was in my mind. She also passed away while I was creating this body of work. So I was thinking a lot about her. This is an installation shot of Climate Vortex Sutra. You can see a real range of my interests, and I even made this warming scale from warm to cold, which you can see in the back, which is actually individual color fields printed in the darkroom, and then I basically adhered them as like a collage to this one panel, and it became this kind of warming from hot to cold Kelvin scale of photographic printing, but also thinking about climate warming. You can see that little self-portrait of me, which was just like a little beauty shot just above the landscapes. And I did this nude portrait painted in, again, like kind of a rainbow color. I just enjoyed doing the analog process of what I thought would almost look digital at this point. So this was kind of my homage to that Edward Weston picture, where I actually went out where he had photographed to try to make my own picture, but it's completely a different landscape now, and also like a lot of erosion, but also like I had to push through all this poison oak and on the coast of California, like just north of Big Sur, and I didn't know it was poison oak, and I was covered head to toe, and it was something I'll never forget. I think I have like scars from the poison oak. It was like so bad that I had to get like a steroid injection. I started working with black and white photographs as well, because I felt like I was talking about earlier, there's this kind of parallel between black and white photography and my color photographs. And I thought maybe if I make that point in an exhibition, other people might see that and recognize that. Not that that's important, I think, ultimately, but maybe I was also just doing it to test it and to see what changes when you have a black and white photograph next to a monochrome color photograph. Also, I just love black and white photographs sometimes. So you can see with the titles, sometimes I was really trying to not only just make this photograph, but the title list would kind of bring up these points about terminologies we were all talking about in 2014-15, or that the news was, how they were covering climate change and what the polar vortex is and how it's shifting, and ice caps, and I enjoyed using those kind of terms to make to activate these photographs. Melancholic metadata. So pretty much this was a project that really started just to focus in on color, climate change, and queerness. And it was a kind of a chaotic exhibition for me, but I also learned a great deal from doing it. You could see with the install shots how I created this kind of salon of pictures, which was a real challenge. But it was also interesting to do with 8x10 analog photographs, and print them in all these ranges, a range of sizes. And it was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed it. This was a photograph of my camera, just like that earlier Sarah Charlesworth photograph. I had shown the slide I'd shown. So 2015 to 2017, things started to change culturally, I think, and also politically. This was right around the time when Donald Trump took office. It feels really weird to say that. I don't know why, but Trump took office. So things were just shifting. I was living in Los Angeles. I was terrified. I was spiraling. I was thinking a lot about, what my rights are as a queer person and my queer family, and everything, my own family, like everything that I have taken for granted forever was just completely starting to come to the surface, and I wanted to hide. Like many people, I mean, I was out protesting, and then to create artwork, I would just go hide in the dark room. I started looking at these beautiful spiral works by Francis, oh, I spelled that wrong, Franix Picabia. It's actually Francis Picabia. There was an exhibition of Picabia's work, and I was really drawn to these kind of mechanical spirals that Picabia was working in. It also brought me to this kind of darkroom based work that I kind of wanted to revisit. Like in my earlier Astral Desert work, I had shown these photograms that I just started messing around with and making in the darkroom. But I wanted to go back to the darkroom. I wanted to hide in the darkroom. I wanted to hide in the dark, and I wanted to make new photograms. I was kind of, driving through the country for all these years. I needed to take a break. And also it just felt really like a kind of a dangerous time to be out on the road politically. So I went to the one color darkroom in LA, and I just kind of holed up there for over the course of a year, and started making photograms. This was a Mohali Naj photogram. I show these at the beginning so you can kind of see what I was looking at. This is a Bruce Conner angel, which is kind of a life-size photogram that Bruce Conner made in the dark room. I also had seen these in person at MoMA earlier, and couldn't stop thinking about these beautiful blueprints that Rauschenberg and Susan Riehl made. And I just love the format of them. They were like these full body, these are full body size. I should have the sizes on here, but I don't. But so it brought me to these photograms, which I titled this work Pink Genesis. And again, I had some fun with the using the titles to kind of create these tensions with the work and give them kind of alternate meanings if you wanted to read the title. You'll also see on the title, there's that 150, it says Sublime Bottom 2, 150C 40M 0Y. So that it was the first time I ever started. For years, while I printed all this monochrome work, I started to, I always recorded every single color I ever created in the darkroom. And there's a pack of 3 different colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow, which make up the color analog darkroom. And when you're printing color, it's pretty much 0 cyan, 45 magenta, 45 yellow. It's just what you learn in color printing classes, which they don't teach anymore pretty much because all the color darkrooms are almost gone. So, but maybe they'll come back. But anyway, so pretty much they tell you in Color 101, don't touch cyan. You're going to find the most natural colors that you want from real life are around the 45 magenta, 45 yellow. It's just the kind of the color pack they call it. So I started like, I made every color of the spectrum you could possibly imagine and recorded every single number and have pieces of these recordings in my studio back in Santa Fe. But I started, and I kind of held them really closely, like they were my palette. But then I started to give them up in this work for those that cared. And I don't know if anybody really, it just, I think was confusing to people, but that were like, what's that number? And I'm like, oh, it's the color pack for the actual color that I printed in the darkroom. But it was a way for me to kind of let go of my process that I held so tightly to myself. Because I felt like I had found something new and I was just like doing it alone in the darkroom and all of a sudden putting this work out into the world. And I wanted to kind of give my secrets away. For anyone that cares about color darkroom printing, I don't know. Sometimes I feel alone in that world, but I know there's others actually out there. I've met them and I'm friends with them, or other artists and stuff. So, but I know that a lot of people, certain people respect the analog process, and I do these kind of subtle nods to it. So if you look in the bottom left corner, you can see the actual color film base, which is Kodak 400 NC2 1621, and actually those little black pieces in the bottom are actually where you pull the film in the dark. So that's I kept those on there because I felt like they again gave away this. It's part of the work. It's like I wanted this analog tactileness process to come through. This is about analog photograms. This is about queerness. And this is about going back to the beginning of the medium and kind of re-examining the history. That's why I called it Pink Genesis. This is the title piece of the show, but Pink Genesis for me became like, going back to the beginning, like the beginning of the medium and kind of and going in there kind of in a punk way to kind of queer the medium, and to give me those photograms that I wanted to see as a kid, made by a queer person using this luxurious color and these bright forms and new ways, and that's really became part of the desire to put these works out into the world. It's a self-portrait with Mars. That's actually a picture of Mars that NASA put out into the world, and you can use those pictures however you want. And I printed a picture of it on cellophane and actually held it on top of the photogram when I made the photogram in the dark. So that's actually my body laying on photographic paper. And yeah, I use titles like empathy because the world really felt like it was caving in around all of us at this time. And I felt like we needed more empathy. revelation. This just became a void for me to stare into, because I don't know how else to describe that time, but these artworks for me were kind of affirming and felt really powerful for me to kind of focus this energy that I had into the artworks. So looks like we're getting close to time here, so I'm going to try to go a little bit faster. Installation views of Pink Genesis. So this brings me to American monuments. This, again, Trump years, I was out photographing. Actually, no, I was reading the news and reading how all of, immediately as Trump took office, that pretty much 2017, the president began to lift protected status of designated American national monuments in the interest of uranium mining and oil drilling. So in 2017, I set out to explore, photograph, and ultimately try and help preserve these wild and hard to reach places over those next 3 years. And also just kind of to try to raise awareness. Bears Ears is such an incredible place. And I felt like not many people, other than the tribal communities that live within the 4 quadrants of it, the 4 different tribal communities, local people understood, a little bit about the area, but it was just kind of this wilderness. Even though it was protected by Obama as a designated national monument, so that meant it was public lands, but it became really complicated making this work, because I really started to understand something deeper about the tribal communities that have been fighting for this. This is ancestral land for their families and their lives, and also a life source. So it became, as a landscape photographer, I just felt like this was an incredible time to try to raise more awareness about this through my artwork. So it was heartbreaking, really heartbreaking to make this body of work, because I felt like, Bears Ears is still not protected. Trump pretty much like desecrated the entire monument, from, lost about 70% of its protections. So there's many parts of what you're seeing here that these were other national monuments around the country, not just Bears Ears, that were up for elimination pretty much. So I immediately went out and trekked through the Southwest, photographing, communing with all these places, and making this work that I called American Monuments. And it was really, it was a really moving, powerful, reflective time for me personally, because it's heartbreaking to look out and see these expansive views in these places and try to share them with everyone else and say like, oh no, what you're looking at will be oil fields. Like, these specific places are going to be drilled, and there'll be mines. Like, you can see them all throughout the West. They're off the road. You can see them, and these beautiful places that are so sacred are going to be destroyed. So I made a book of the work. I made 2 exhibitions of the work, and I'm still, it's still relevant, because I feel like in many ways, yes, we have a new president, but Bears Ears is in the news again, because everyone is hoping that Deb Haaland will actually, give Bears Ears back to its original, its original protection. You can see the size here. I really wanted to create something huge, and give you this, one thing about the color and seeing the work too in person is also that there's this experience. I talk about this performance a lot, but there's this experience about seeing and being in these places that's so hard to convey actually in a photograph. And that's something that I feel like that's what continues me to make my landscape photographs is that like it's wanting to share that experience, and it's an emotional experience for me pretty much. Being alone in these places, watching the sun move throughout the day, staying in one place, having this patience with the camera and with my work. And you know, I hope in the end, my hope is that the photographs kind of bring all these different things together, but also can just give the viewer a space to feel that same thing, and maybe excite some type of feeling in the viewer to want to see the world and respect nature and Mother Earth, and you know, think about landscape and what these original, you know, these lands actually, who belong to them, or you know, what we're standing on, what ground we're standing on, indigenous ground. So it's all of these things. It's a lot. This is, I'm just going to breeze through. This is just like a project I've been working on since 2012 while taking landscape pictures. I've also been working on a social kind of documentary project throughout the Western states. Pretty much, you can imagine, these are some inspiration pictures that I look at that I love, but pretty much you can imagine going through all these places that I've encountered a lot of different people and a lot of amazing, incredible people, and also people that are, you know, really scary that I have to kind of run away from because of, you know, identity and politics and political. The country is kind of still, the country's a mess. I mean, it's a pandemic, and half the country still wants a different president. So it's a crazy cultural moment, and it's also an amazing cultural moment to live through. And as a photographer, I can't help but take pictures of my experience through it. So these are some photographs that I thought I'd share with you all. One of the projects I've been working on, and starting to edit this work and starting to really print it and look at it. These are some photographs from my travels throughout the country, 8x10 portraits, landscapes, and yeah, I think you can kind of understand some of the different, pretty much like different, what my interests, you know, it's like as this project kind of examines, I think, our complex relationship to the American landscape amidst these massive cultural environmental shifts, as mediated through my own point of view as a queer white man. So, you know, it's mostly black and white photographs. There's a few color photographs, but I'm interested in capturing, you know, diverse subjects dispersed throughout our country, including those whose very existence serves as a provocation to their white, heteronormative, and patriarchal contexts. And that's where I'm going to end it. Thank you all for listening and for being here and taking the time. Sorry that I have gone over a little bit. Hope it doesn't cut into everything, but anybody out there? Sorry.
Thanks so much, David, for sharing all of your striking work with us. So I'll just ask a couple of questions to get the ball rolling while the audience is putting their questions in the Q&A panel. I'll just jump right into something hard, right? So you brought up themes in your talk related to the history of photography in the American West and the legacy of colonization. And there's certainly this, there's this critique of landscape art, landscape painting originally, and then photography, that it can really sometimes be seen as serving that kind of sort of imperial agenda, right? Particularly when it presents the land as sort of terra nullius, right? Like empty space that anybody can simply claim, right? But then on the other hand, as you showed us with like your work that was focusing on petroglyphs, and Bill McKibben wrote about this in your work in his essay in Aperture, about how it also sort of evokes the way in which those very processes have displaced people from the land. So, you know, the emptiness can function, right, in both ways, perhaps depending on when the work is made and sort of how it's presented. So I was just wondering how you as an artist grapple with and think through that legacy in your work, sort of when you sort of aim to represent people in the landscape, as in that sort of portrait that you closed with, versus some of your more colorful work where people are absent. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, I entered it pretty naively when I first started making landscape pictures. It was just like this really natural, like I was saying, growing up in the East Coast, I had never been out West. I never had seen these places other than through photographs. So as I got deeper into it, and as I'm still processing it and going through it, and and photographing, I think I actively am trying to understand through the work what it means as as a queer person to enter these spaces. And that's kind of where I'm at. Like I pretty much I just feel like as an artist there hasn't been work that spoke about that part of identity and landscape. So I think there's elements of like ecofeminism, let's say, that I really was interested in when I started doing more landscape work. And then I think I identified way more with an ecofeminist idea about nature and what we're doing, climate change, and how the Earth is rapidly changing. And a lot of my work started to kind of go in this direction of like, let's raise awareness about environmental problems through my work. And I can talk about that. Like the cover of the Aperture issue, it's like the Earth issue, and Bill McKibben, who's like this top environmentalist, talking about environmentalism and what the work's doing. But I think there's something, obviously that has to be kind of also reconciled with making this work and just living on the land that we're living on. Like me sitting at this hotel in this place, like recognizing what it was like, not that long ago. it's living in New Mexico, it's like living in Santa Fe. It's been eye-opening, and also I'm learning a lot about what it means to live on indigenous land that's been stolen through all decades and decades of like Ansel Adams to Carlton Watkins. They were photographing the land as it was with this, I believe, a different agenda, like it was this manifest destiny, colonialized space. And we're looking at that work and reviewing it and thinking about it differently now because it's all coming to the surface. But I think that sometimes maybe that's part of also the point with my work at this moment, is to have that space to think about these things too and process them. And I think that, using the color, it separates it from reality in this way. And I'm really interested in that. And I'm interested in what that does. Like it gives you this thinking space. Like the actual, like the essay for the American Monuments book was written by Terry Tempest Williams, who I'm actually meeting tonight, who is like an incredible woman writer, who's opened my mind to so many things. And processing this with her and having, like, she lives in this landscape, she lives underneath these beautiful arches in Utah, and she talks about the color and how it has this kind of, it gives you this space. At the beginning of the book, there's this essay, and I'm kind of doing a terrible job of explaining it, but I'm basically like, she kind of understood that the color was this space to process and to think and to step back and think about this as a mindset rather than just the physical place. Like, this is also Bears Ears, but it's also, what does this color evoke? How does this color make you feel? and give you time to think about what's been done on these lands, what's continuing to be done before our eyes.
Yeah, thanks. That's also a fun Wellesley connection, because Terry Tempest Williams was just here like sort of a year or two ago. So
Oh, really?
yeah.
I didn't even know that. I know she's at Harvard. I wasn't sure. I didn't know that she was at Wellesley. Oh, I can't wait to
She
tell.
spoke here. She spoke here.
Oh, she spoke there. I was like, oh, was she teaching? She just.
No.
I mean, what a great speaker too. I mean, everybody. Whenever I hear her speak, I just start tearing up. I mean, when I first met her, we just cried. Like we just sat and cried because, you know, as like just having this experience, like the piece that I was reading about the minor white, it kind of like stopped me. I wrote that on the side of the road, thinking about like how it's been really hard. It's hard for for a lot of us, but like as a queer person, like I just feel like all of a sudden after years of making this landscape work, I was like, I'm constantly like made aware of it, so it becomes a real, it's just like to exist in this world at this moment as a queer person is, I'm just processing it. And I think that part of the work is about that.
Yeah, I love that idea of the work giving people sort of space to think and sort of reflect on the landscape and our relationship to it. And I think that sort of makes explicit that opportunity to sort of reflect and engage, right, in a way that maybe some of the sort of the legacy that was operating sort of implicitly with this sort of like imperial agenda, right, it was sort of like putting the thinking like underneath and sort of bringing space to sort of engage with it. But, I think that's great. I see there's some questions in the queue. I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe I'll help us transition to some of the questions that the audience has. So some of your work is portraiture and self-portraiture, and some of your work is what we'll call landscape, right? And I'm wondering about how you think about those two different kinds of artwork, and whether you think about them as sort of distinct from each other or related in some way. So like when people write about portraiture, they often talk about portraiture as endeavoring to sort of capture the character of the sitter, right? Sort of their like inner essence, sort of like rendering visually something that is hidden, right? And I wonder if that's something that you also think about applying to your work that takes landscape as its subject, or if you think about landscape in sort of a different way.
I think I think about my monochrome color landscapes as portraiture in many ways, because again, it kind of goes back to this color and what it does and how it resonates. When you're, when I'm looking at a rock and like thinking about like this massive monolith and how I'm taking a photograph of this thing and like defining it by the light that I'm watching move throughout the day, and then using this color to kind of dress the rock in many ways, I can't help but think of it as a portrait. I did a lot of self-portraiture of my pictures of myself in landscapes before I actually started taking just landscape pictures. And I think that just came from like a early 20s identity, kind of figuring out myself and like how I fit into this place. Like, I would just get these ideas and really just go with them. And I really, enjoyed that performance, because a lot of them were just performative. It was going to a place and matching my body paint to almost the place and photographing myself in it. But I think that it was necessary to do, and it kind of got me to a place of confidence, being outdoors and understanding what it's like to spend multiple days in front of one tree, and how it's not really separate from, I mean, at least how I think about like human lives and a tree's life, and like the earth and how connected it is to the human body. And to me, it was like this perfect kind of marriage between human and earth, and I needed to kind of bring them together. And that's kind of where I think the monochrome landscapes become one. in a way, for me at least. Like that's how I identify with them. I've kind of removed, I don't think I'll probably do any more who knows, maybe when I don't know, I don't even know what happens next, but I think taking portraits, there's just like, the newer work that I was showing, the portraits, it just, I ended up started taking portraits because, not because I was like, I'm setting out to take portraits, but I just ended up meeting such incredible people. And I was like, maybe it's like my own, like, like sometimes there's a calling in the world when you're walking down the street and somebody's like, hello. And you're like, oh, hello. And then they're like, what's your name? And then, I mean, this happens to me a lot. So I just was like, maybe I should like lean into that a little bit and start documenting these people that I meet. And that's kind of what I've been doing. And sometimes I think they're great portraits. Sometimes I'm like, oh, that's why even when I presented some of the work, I'm like, I don't really know yet how to talk about this, because it's just things that are brewing in my little studio kitchen corner wall cabinet that I'm like, oh, those portraits, America, like it's crazy. It's like too much for me to even think about, really.
Yeah, I love the portrait of the woman in her car though, because the color of the car pops so much, and it reminds, I feel like it's like evocative of some of your landscapes, the color.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I felt like, I mean, her lips are the exact same color. And that was just like, what a beautiful afternoon. Like I just like saw her sitting in her car like that. And I just was like really quick. I mean, the 8x10, it's so hard to make documentary photograph, and that's kind of why I showed some of those earlier, like Sternfeld, Walker Evans, like because they kind of were masters at, and Dorothea Lange, like using a large format camera to do something documentary, I think, at least. So yeah, I became like, oh, like I should lean into taking portraits, but it's such a different set of challenges to even try to understand. Like for the most part, I will take a portrait of someone I meet, but I fumble so much because I'm like, thank you for taking the time. Oh, I don't want to inconvenience you. Like I'm David. Nice to meet you. Okay, hold it. Like I'm not like this pro at, I love talking to people, but once you put this big camera, they get all freaked out. And I am learning about that.
Yeah.
And also what it means to take a portrait of someone that, like, that woman in her car, like, what does it mean? Like, how do I even talk about that? Like, I don't know yet. I just know that it felt in my mind like she was like amazing, and it felt like kind of queer in the sense of like purple, beautiful car, everything's color coded and matching, and I'm like, can I take your portrait? She's like, yeah, of course. I'm like, cool. Like she was waiting to have her portrait taken. I was like, yeah. But there's a color thing happening there that I think is another thing that I'm starting to understand a little bit. Like, oh, maybe that maybe when I do a portrait project, I'll look for more color oriented monochrome in the like natural monochrome things in the world rather than making the monochrome.
Yeah. So here I'll ask one more question that will help sort of queue up I think one of the questions in the Q&A panel. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your darkroom process. So especially for those of us who have never had the opportunity, right, to do darkroom work in color. So you talked about how, unlike in black and white, darkroom work is sort of pitch black, or you can't see, right? You talked about it being very tactile. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how that works? And then I think that'll help people understand Emily's cool question about darkroom as performance and whether you recreate those.
Yeah, it's like I was kind of like biting my tongue in the middle of talking about the darkroom stuff, because I'm like, oh, in my next like future presentation, I'm gonna have a picture of me in the darkroom and a picture of the darkroom. So it's like this second home space for me. Like I'm so used to it, so I talk about it very candidly, but I realize it's like very strange for a lot of people to kind of wrap their head around. So it's a good question. Pretty much it's like this box, like, wait, so you want me to explain what it's like in the darkroom, or just like how I'm doing it? A little bit.
Whatever direction you'd like to.
Okay. Yeah, like with color photography, it's way more toxic, okay, than actual black and white photography. So there's all, like, for instance, like processing your film for black and white. A lot of people in photo one that still have black and white darkrooms learn how to do this black and white. You can still learn that in high schools, which is great. But color, it's highly toxic and very unstable. So I work with someone who processes my film, and they process 8x10 sheets, and they're in Boston, and they're great. And I ship my film from the road to Boston whenever I'm shooting, because a lot of things can go wrong. Like the other week I was out shooting, and there was like a light leak through the back of the camera that I didn't know about. So I sent my film, waited in a spot, and then the person I work with was like, David, there seems to be a light leak, switch cameras. So I always bring a second 8x10 camera with me. So I immediately started shooting on the other camera. That just gives you an understanding of the film. And like, it's what's beautiful about it is you're really just engaging in the moment with the thing you're photographing. And you have these kind of like, you don't know what you're going to get. Like it's really fun. Like and I think that that's part of the beauty of it too, is like, I don't know what I just took. I don't know, like a day will happen of shooting, and then I'll be like, what did I even take pictures of? I'm like, oh yeah, that tree, that cloud. Like, and then I'm like, oh, I kind of lose myself in the shooting process so much that I feel really disconnected from what I saw, because it's like looking through this box upside down and backwards. So I have to use this cloth, and that whole process is really intense. But then when I get the film back, I'm like, oh, there's that tree, there's that cloud. Like, these are the memories that I had from that day on film, which is an interesting kind of diaristic way of reflecting for me in my own life and my travels and stuff throughout the country. But the darkroom part becomes like, I use the computer at the very beginning to scan my film in, to make sure everything's scanned into like a digital archive. And I kind of number every single negative and this and that. But then once I kind of find the pictures that I really like, I'll go into the darkroom and actually make small prints of a photograph, and I'll have this color pack, these colors that I've written down, like I was explaining before. I have this book of all these colors. So I'll like think about the actual color of a specific place, because I usually write notes about that one. If it's a tree that is almost vibrating green in real life, I'll take a note of that, and I'll push that color to green to see what happens and if it will work. So I'll test out the pictures in a very small size. When I'm doing that, I put the negative into an enlarger, which is this, really tall, the 8x10 enlarger is fairly big. And it's a box with a light on top that you control by a pedal and a little dial. The negative slides inside, so the light projects through, and between the lens, it's basically like a big camera turned on its side. You're basically using a camera to project light through the negative now through an open lens to photographic paper, which sits waist level. For me, it's like down on the floor, up on a wall. But through the filters are pretty much these cyan, magenta, yellow filters that come together into one filter, and you have little dials to control the amount from 0 to 300 of each color. So every number you can imagine, 20 cyan, 50 magenta, 73 yellow, will give you a different color. And there is a science to it. Like, I can't really get into that right now, but it's boring too, I think, for most people. But that becomes kind of like my palette, So I use that, and then I just kind of go for it in the dark. So I pretty much, the surface of the paper, I have to feel on my face to feel which side is, you can hear the sound or you don't hear a sound. And if you don't hear a sound, then it's the right side of the paper, and everything's measured out and tape. I use tape in the dark to kind of create my own space. So I know where I'm touching, and I know where everything goes. It's all done in the dark. It's basically like what it would probably feel like to be blind, which, I mean, it completely is. There's no light whatsoever. So you're using light sensitive paper that can't be exposed to any light whatsoever. Once it is, it's ruined. We call it flashed. Like if you flash your paper, then you're, the big rolls of really expensive photographic paper, because the prices have all gone up because nobody does this anymore. I mean, people do, and it's actually like vinyl records, like people are like, oh my God, there's all this new interest in film photography and darker color, which is great.
Thank you so much. There are some great questions in the Q&A, so I think I will fade to the back, but thank you very much, David.
So
Thank you, Eric, for facilitating that conversation and for the great presentation, David. It was really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we do have some really good questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with one from Sierra Chow, who I'm just going to summarize. She has two really good questions. The first is wondering if your process of creating art has changed or informed the relationship you have with queer identity. And then the second part of her question, she's wondering how you manage the potential tokenization or responsibility of creating art as a queer person within such a straight male dominated history of landscape photography.
Well, big questions. The first part has, if I understood this right, I think that art making for me is a continual process of discovery. Like, I'm not one of these artists that like dialed in, like, oh, this is the thing I make over and over again. Sometimes I wish I was like a little more like that. But you can see through my various projects that I kind of bounce around through a few themes and ideas. And I think I'm learning a lot more as I do it. And as I get older, more confident in what I'm doing. But I don't think that, I just think that my experience is very different than anybody else's experience as a queer person. So I can't say what it's like for really anyone else, but I think that I have come to understand myself as a queer person in this landscape, in this really troubled landscape, and complicated landscape. And I feel like I'm starting to fit right in a weird way too, because there's so many layers to unfold of what American identity at this point is, right? So I guess that kind of brings us to the next part of the question, which I forgot.
How you manage the potential tokenization or responsibility of being a queer person in this genre that...
Right. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. So, well, that for me is a little bit like, these are great questions, by the way. And I think as an artist, one of the beautiful things about being an artist is that these are questions that we all need to be asked, right? And like, I also don't necessarily have answers to, but the work itself can kind of maybe speak to that. And it sometimes becomes reflexive of ourselves in a way. So I do think that in my queer community that I have a lot of support and from other queer artists. And I feel like I found my own little space within this kind of genre of photography, let's say. But I don't think I can speak for everyone's, like, I think of like Laura Aguilar, her photographs of her body, her body in the landscape, and the photographs I'm talking about with the large rocks in the California desert, and her nude body kind of placed next to the rocks, and like how she's talking about her culture you know, as a Latina woman, I think she identified as a woman, but I'm not exactly sure, but she's a queer person. And I think that it was so, you know, that work was like really, really important for, I think, her culture, but also for queer people. Like for me, it was really important because there's this like queer umbrella, you know, that we all kind of are starting to understand more, with younger generations identifying as different parts in this whole spectrum of stuff. So one thing I like about the queer community is that it does feel very accepting of all the varying degrees of what you may identify as or with, and what your experience was like. And there is a commonality. There's something that feels extremely, at least my generation, like when I was talking about early in the presentation, I was talking about growing up, being born 1981, the year that AIDS pretty much took hold and became, you know, this news, it became this entire like from 1981. I mean, we're still dealing with AIDS, but battling, but you know, it pretty much really affected a lot of people that were my age too, in this other way. Like became really, I was really fearful for most of my adolescence, like I was saying. And I think that I'm still finding queer people that had a similar experience. And I'm like, oh, so you thought you were going to die too for like half, until you were like 18, like you didn't want to, you know, like, or 20 or 21, even 24. I mean, for me, it was 25. Like, I just was like, oh, I just thought that I would die like really young. So that, I mean, I'm still unpacking that. It's only been 15 years since I'm 40 now, like I said, but I think that my work really is part of that process for me, at least, of understanding how I can communicate with other. I mean, I've had a lot of really awesome, supportive, younger queer people send me messages and a few letters, which is always, I mean, it's like the nicest thing. You don't understand like how, if I can like open up this canon of photography that I am like trying to crack open a little bit more for other queer people to feel comfortable to go out into the world and like go on a trail hiking and not like, and like hold hands. Like, I mean, it is like a beautiful thing when you see it, but it's like rare, very rare still. Like, I mean, we're in Utah. I'm in Utah. Like, me and my partner do not hold hands on the trail. Like, because it's such a volatile time culturally, but also because we're just not comfortable. Like, we just have to live in a certain way. And when I make my work, it like, I don't have to hide. I don't have to do anything. I can really just let it be. So that's part of why the color is the color and the queerness is laid bare.
Well, it's such beautiful.
Long-winded.
No, I
Thank
mean,
you. It's such a long-winded question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that, I'm sad that we're out of time and that we can't continue this conversation. But it's been so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And I'm going to reiterate what someone wrote. Actually, another photographer who participated in this series wrote in the chat, "Thank you for this very personal talk and your deeply experienced photographs." And I completely reiterate that sentiment. It's really refreshing. So thank you so much. And thank you, Erich, for joining him in conversation. I want to remind everyone that the Handmade Photography Today Artist Talk series will conclude on Wednesday, May 26th, with a presentation by Pushpamala N. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And thank you again, David. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.